Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. This week I'm going to be taking a look at an old classic, at least one of my personal classics, that being Howard Jones' Dream into Action. Dream into Action was released in 1985, and there's probably not another album in my collection that epitomizes this idea about the positive patina that we have of the 80s. Because Howard Jones' approach to synth pop in 1985 was definitely in alignment with that idea. You know, I've spoken before about how in the 80s we look back on it with the sort of fondness and the sort of feeling that things were more innocent back then, but really it was kind of some dark overtones to the time. And Howard Jones battled that idea of the tone of the 80s at the time, I think, by being more optimistic in his approach to synth pop. And if you know anything about this album as a whole, it's got a lot of his most famous and greatest hits on it. A lot of these songs are tunes that you probably have heard before. They're out there in your cultural memory somewhere. Might even be floating on a playlist of yours somewhere. But I'd also like to take a look at this album on the whole, because the album also holds together as a really great statement and a very interesting point between more polished synth pop from the 80s, but also has some more adventurous undertones to it. And there are several really great classic songs in this that epitomize, I think, the 80s. Like to Get to Know You Well, Things Can Only Get Better, and Life in One Day. This album also harbors in it another song of Howard Jones's that actually probably arguably is his greatest hit. And that's the song No One Is to Blame. But if you get this album, you listen to it, the version that's on Dream into Action is not the one that made it onto the radio. This is the original version of this song is on this one. And the one that was released onto the radio was released, I think, maybe a year or two after Dream into Action had come out. But he had reconvened with some people and they re-recorded the song with the help of Phil Collins, who was like the top-notch hot producer at the time. And Phil Collins helped him kind of dress it up and played live drums on it. But the original version actually is one that I really like a lot because it's, first of all, it's the one that I know originally. I didn't like all the bells and whistles on the remake of it, but that was just partially because it challenged my idea of the song. And the version that's on Dream into Action is really not much more than just Howard Jones and a keyboard and a drum machine. And although it's tempting to go out and get all those songs and put them on a playlist and, you know, get your Howard Jones fix that way if you're going to do it that way, Dream into Action actually has a great cohesion across all of its tracks, I think. Many of the other B-sides on this album really show Howard Jones's deeper thought processes on this album. Because the beautiful thing about what he was doing on Dream into Action, and Howard Jones, I think, in general, is that although he played into this sort of positive mindset that we associate with the 80s. He was optimistic, but he was also realistic. He doesn't set positivity out as something that just happens. He challenges ideas and talks about how positivity very often in this album is something that needs to be attained through work or through confronting challenging ideas, which in my opinion made it a perfect album for me as an adolescent. I mean, the songs are about things that generally a person in their early teens can relate to. But it doesn't pander. For example, there's a low-key hit on this album from UK called Look Mama, which is pretty much just a song about a teenager asserting his independence from his parents. And it's not really meant to be super confrontational, but at the same time, it's a decisive point that he makes in the song about, you know, I'm striking out on my own, I'm doing my own thing, I love you, but I have to live my own life. He talks about this funny line between technology and humanity. He talks about vegetarianism. He talks about how the soul possibly clings to the body after it passes on. And kind of before his time, talks a little bit about depression. And there's even some overtones where the character that Howard Jones is talking about is kind of contemplating dark things. But then in all the verses, he turns it around and talks about you have to fight the negative and not be defeated by negative thoughts. So Howard Jones, throughout this album, admits that there is difficulty, admits there's darkness, but always tries to provide positive solutions for those conditions. Now, the surprisingly deep concepts that are kind of hidden throughout Dream into Action when you start to look for them are also mirrored in surprisingly deep musical components as well. Although in the 80s we kind of bemoaned his use of automation, in retrospect, it's actually very impressive the way in which he used sequencing at the time. His compositions, the way that he writes stuff on Dream into Action, has a lot of depth and a lot of layers, and the programming is all things that he did. On the other hand, along with that, there's this funny blurry line between his programming and his sequencing and his actual keyboard playing. Howard Jones is no slouch of a keyboard player in any stretch of the imagination. As a matter of fact, in the process of researching for this post, I discovered that Howard Jones, as his main influences, two of his big main influences, was Stevie Wonder and Keith Emerson. And now I almost can't unhear that when I listen to this album in a very positive way. Because I feel like Dream into Action in particular, you see him wrestling with these two extremes. You know, Stevie Wonder has this kind of positive style, even though his music topically isn't always super positive. His presentation is always very kind of uplifting. But then he has these really kind of orchestral, thematic work that Howard Jones does that once I hear now that it sounds like Keith Emerson, it's all over the place. The way he uses these kind of brass fanfares, these themes, and the way he voices chords, it's straight out of the Keith Emerson playbook. And additionally, I think it's important to also acknowledge Howard Jones as a vocalist. These aren't the kind of tunes, I think, that you would walk into a karaoke bar and take lightly. His ability to hit intervals and break across his falsetto and big leaps in his voice is astounding and very difficult to pull off. And again, this is a time before Pro Tools. This is a time before Auto-Tune. Howard Jones had to go in and sing those things repeatedly very often. So for me personally, this was an album that came about during what I call my bicycle years. My main mode of transportation was when I got a 10-speed bike in 7th grade and spent a good amount of time biking all over South Austin with headphones on, with a Walkman on. And I do remember very distinctly listening to this album during that time. Around the same time I was like listening to Tears for Fears and stuff, which is, again, a very interesting middle point between my love for Hall & Oates as a very young music listener and then Rush later on, especially since this album was produced by Rupert Hine, who would later go on and produce some of Rush's 90s albums. Maybe they're not their most iconic work, but still there's a connection there that puts Howard Jones sort of with one foot in that progressive rock world, that mindset. And so his role as a stop between the more pop underpinnings that I had for a while in my younger musical interests, and as I became a more progressive rock fan, I think it's interesting to look at it in retrospect. Of course, I didn't realize it at the time, but Dream into Action played a big role in my musical growth going forward. So it's an album that I really do love, and I suggest to anybody. It does sound, of course, very 80s. It's an 80s album, and in some ways a very ubiquitous 80s album. Many of those songs were in movies and on the radio and on TV, but it's one of those situations where songs were good and got recognition for actually being good. But that's all I really have to say about Howard Jones and Dream into Action this week. If you like the video, please like and subscribe and share this out with your friends. Follow me over on Spotify, of course. I'm going to be putting a track up from Dream into Action on my 2021 playlist. And next week I'll be looking into something else. Until then, catch you on the flip side.